Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Debrief. This week, we're going to cover the Marko Rupnik scandal, the Synod's synthesis report, and then Bishop Strickland travels to Rome. Hey, Mike, and hey, everyone, welcome back to the Debrief. It's our weekly show where we're talking about news, questions, and controversies facing the Catholic Church. I'm Dominic de Souza, the founder of SmartCatholics.
And I'm Mike Lewis, the editor and co-founder of the website Where Peter Is. Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween, All Souls, All Saints, and everything woo-woo and spiritual. So,
Exactly.
just thinking this week, I was washing dishes. The Catholic Church is one of the most woo sort of things out there, so none of this should be surprising to anybody. Speaking of things, though, that do surprise and did surprise people, this past week, on October 25th, the Diocese of Koper in Slovenia announced that they had accepted the former Jesuit and renowned artist Marko Rupnik into the diocese. The artist stands accused of sexually abusing around 20 women and one man, even though an investigation into the charges led the Jesuit order and the DDF to conclude that the charges were extremely credible. Pope Francis decided not to waive the statute of limitations on the allegations, so Rupnik did not face any trial or sanctions. The diocese said that they incarcerated him on the grounds that he had not been formally sentenced in any crime, and that until that happened, he was free to engage in public ministry. 2 days later, on October 27th, the Vatican issued a statement announcing that the Pontifical Commission for the Protections of Minors had flagged the serious problems in the handling of the case, prompting Pope Francis to lift the statute of limitations. So, Mike, you then wrote a very critical article about the handling of the case on your Substack. What did you make of all this?
Yeah, so just to backtrack, and it was kind of funny because last week we recorded on Tuesday and I didn't post our debrief until Wednesday, and by the time I had posted it on Wednesday, it felt a little hollow and empty. I mean, obviously the traditionalist issue is something that's ongoing. It contributes to the crisis of credibility in the church, but the number one issue in the Catholic Church right now when it comes to trusting the church, trusting what the hierarchy has to say. I mean, the crisis of credibility is this abuse scandal, and it's hit it hit the US in 2002. We had round 2 in 2018. And the church, the hierarchy has, in my opinion, very little room for error when it comes to handling these situations. So Marko Rupnik is a Slovenian Jesuit, or was a Slovenian Jesuit, who is famous for his mosaics, which appear in churches, basilicas, shrines, cathedrals around the world. I know that in the United States, Sacred Heart University has their chapel has his mosaics on the wall. The John Paul II shrine in Washington, D.C. I believe, has 7 or 8 of his mosaics prominently featured. The Knights of Columbus headquarters in Connecticut has it as well, has his work prominently featured as well. This was a big visible scandal because he is a well-known priest. Yet, inexplicably, I guess since his accusations of abuse have come from mostly adult women, and because the bulk of the allegations happened in the 1980s and 1990s, when the reports from the DDF and the Jesuits came to Pope Francis, they had eclipsed the statute of limitations. But for some reason, Pope Francis, even though he will do it for children, he's made, when it's abuse of children, or when the case warrants it, he will waive that statute of limitations. It's a papal prerogative, obviously, as the supreme legislator in the church. He chose not to. That caused, I would say, a bit of a scandal. Shortly thereafter, the Jesuits kicked him out of their order due to disobedience. And it seemed to me that the Jesuits were hoping that he would face sanctions. People who were, I guess you could call them Pope splainers. People call me a Pope splainer, but I'm not. I defend the Pope when there's a defense being offered that I can respond to. But they were saying, well, he's effectively suspended. He's been kicked out of the Jesuits. He doesn't have a bishop to answer to. He can't operate as a priest in good standing. Okay, that's not a great answer, but that's, I mean, what are you going to do? And so that was late in 2022. And then we get this news. I guess he was kicked out of the Jesuits in the summer. Then we get this news that he's been incardinated into a diocese in Slovenia. And presumably they weren't going to assign him to a parish in Slovenia. They were basically going to say, okay, I'm your bishop now, and I'm recognizing your apostolate, your art, your whatever in Rome. So he was going to be able, in theory, to pick up where he left off with no punishments as a priest in good standing because he has a bishop that has his back. And the thing is, at any step along the way, Pope Francis, regardless of his involvement in this, had the ability to just put a stop to it. Or if he had allowed if he had waived that statute of limitations, allowing him to go on trial, presumably he would have, I mean, if you read the testimonies, and I shared one specific one in my article, but there are several other ones. This isn't a case of a lapse in judgment or temptation. This is a textbook example of a career abuser. He grooms women. He would get them under his spell, under his authority, under his spiritual manipulation. They would do things that were in some cases blasphemous. And he had a pattern of behavior. So why? So I mean, the thing is, there ultimately there was the blame fell on Pope Francis. Now this, I don't know what the explanation is. I think that the Vatican needs to offer a more thorough explanation. As you mentioned, they refer back to September or a September letter from the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors. Yet the Vatican, it's a month later, and it wasn't until 2 days after the news of his incardination and a media outcry, including from Mike Lewis of Where Peter Is, that this is unacceptable. This needs to be addressed. And to me, it struck me as the synod is going on. The synod, one of the main purposes of the synod is to rebuild credibility in the church and have the church respond to those who have been hurt by the church or who are suffering. To have the conclusion of the synod coincide with this news about Father Rupnik is it was astounding. It left me speechless. And so I had to speak up about it. And of course we know that people tell people will say all the time, we've had popes who have been sinners, they've been adulterers, they've been involved in simony and all kinds of personal sins, all kinds of have made all kinds of prudential errors. And that would apply as well in the case of Pope Francis. Nobody is perfect. Yet for a pope who had supposedly experienced this transformation back in 2018 with the Chile cardinals or the Chile bishops, and they had the abuse summit in 2019, and all of a sudden we have this talk about zero tolerance. Well, he's setting a terrible example. Doesn't necessarily mean that his teaching or even the thrust of his papacy is wrong, but he's certainly doing great damage to the credibility of the church.
So, excuse me, rather than publishing this on the Where Peter Is site, you published this on your personal Substack. Why'd you do that?
Well, first of all, one of the decisions that we made very early in the history of the site when we were developing our editorial standards, you can find criticism of Pope Francis at plenty of other sites. and I'm talking about outright objective, just I disagree with this type criticism. That is not to say that we believe in principle that prudential disagreement with the Pope is wrong. And Where Peter Is contributors have written for other sites or have written on their own personal blogs criticisms of Pope Francis's policies, decisions, in some cases, even his articulation of teachings. And that's fine. Like, we don't oppose that. But if you want to find criticism of Pope Francis, there are plenty of websites to go to. We also don't Pope-splain. It would have been against my integrity and the integrity of the contributors of the site to try to make up some, I don't know how you would do it, but some reasonable excuse for why Pope Francis didn't act in this case. If there is no defense that's plausible, then we aren't going to make one up. So in this case, I felt that this fell into that area of strong prudential criticism of Pope Francis. I wanted to express it, but I didn't want to express it on Where Peter Is, because the purpose of the site does not involve criticism of his papacy. So that's in a nutshell why I published it privately.
Very good. And so, speaking of then criticism and everything that's being leveled, the 2023 Synod final document is now wrapping up and is finally released in English. So after 4 weeks of meeting in mostly closed sessions, the October 2023 Assembly of the Synod on Synodality wrapped up over the weekend. And on Saturday, the final synthesis report of the 2023 Vatican Synodal Assembly was titled A Synodal Church in Mission, was released in Italian. The English version of the document finally released today. What can you tell us about the report?
So it's, I've heard it's 41 pages long. I think the English might be 42. It's a comprehensive document that reflects on various aspects of, for lack of a better expression, and I know a lot of especially Catholic conservatives hate this expression, but it focused on being church, how we as a church operate. There's an introduction, there's a conclusion, and there are 20 chapters making up the body of the document. So talking about the laity, talking about priests and deacons, talking about bishops, talking about women in the church, talking about missionary activity. Each of these had 3 sections with 3 or 4 paragraphs that were lettered paragraphs underneath it. So A through E would be matters, was convergences. And then these are areas of agreement. Like, we all agree that the missions are good, or this is where there was a general consensus. Then let's say F through G was matters for consideration. So some of these subjects, maybe they hadn't reached a consensus as a group, or it was something that maybe the Pope or the bishops would need to delve more deeply into, or things that warranted future study. So that group was matters for consideration. And then the final, let's say H through L, was proposals. And these were actually concrete suggestions, like, this is a topic that we need to start a study on, or we need to be more vigilant about this or this or this. The document passed overwhelmingly. Each of these paragraphs was approved by at least 80% of the participants, and most of them were well above 90%. I'd say that 75% of the paragraphs were 93% or higher, essentially. Wow. So very broad consensus. Although, to note, not a single one was approved by a unanimous majority. So it's funny. There are several paragraphs that have 1 or 2 no votes, and I just sort of picture a grouchy retired cardinal from some far-flung diocese that's like hitting the no button on every single one. I mean, now granted, it's his prerogative. It was electronic vote. It was anonymous, so that people would be able to vote freely without fear of repercussion. But there's just something interesting to note.
So you wrote an article about the, quote, spiciest paragraphs in the document. What does that mean? Can you explain what that means?
So one of the things, obviously, people were immediately talking about some of the paragraphs that were more that got the most no votes. Women deacons was one of them. There were a couple about priestly celibacy and possibly relaxing that. Now, keep in mind, every single one of them got 80% approval or higher, and the ones about women deacons were not like proposals to let's have women deacons. They were let's explore this more deeply. Or we had there were commissions, I think, in 2016 and 2020 on women deacons, and they were submitted to the Pope, like the possibility. They brought thinkers and theologians and historians together to study the question, and we've never seen the results of these reports. We don't know what was said or what it points to. So, one of the items was, let's see these reports. Let's hear about what they, or a summary at least of what was developed. They basically they were able to talk about synodality. Once again, this is a word that it's funny because I've actually talked to 2 or 3 delegates or participants in the synod, and they're on fire for synodality. Unfortunately, this whole thing happened behind closed doors. What that synodal conversion they had, what that means, I don't know how that experience that the 300 or 400 people had in the Paul VI hall that we didn't get to see. How is that type of church dialogue, which actually, when you hear about how it was undertaken, and Jerry O'Connell from America in the most recent Jesuitical podcast gives a good overview of the process, and Father James Martin also took part in that podcast, talking about like, okay, well, they bring up the topic, and then everybody gets 3 minutes to speak, and there's a facilitator, and everybody, even if there's a disagreement, there's a dialogue, and then they sort of come to a conclusion. It sounded like a very good way of engaging people, not quite a meeting, but one of those, but the structure allowed for people to respectfully express themselves, not to feel pressure from the outside, freedom to speak freely, and not to check what they were, what they might otherwise say, because if these interventions are public, then people with spicier, for lack of a better word, takes aren't going to be, they might not be as forthcoming. But on the whole, yeah, it was basically different proposals, trying to think. A couple of interesting ones that got wide approval were to take a new look at the Code of Canon Law. We had a Code of Canon Law that was implemented in 1917, which was that the process of composing that code was started by Pius X, and then it was finished by Benedict the 15th. So it was a years-long process, and then right around Vatican, maybe the end of Vatican II, I'm not sure if it's proposed in a Vatican II document or if it was Paul VI shortly thereafter, but they proposed a new Code of Canon Law, which was finally promulgated in 1983. So from 1917 to mid-1960s, that's 50 years. 2023, we're looking at 40 years from the release of our current code, although we've undertaken a few overhauls of certain sections since then. But maybe it's time to take a new look at the Code of Canon Law. I don't know. But it was interesting that was one of the concrete proposals. Another interesting proposal that they made had to do with safeguarding and the protection of minors. And they discussed putting into place a mechanism to hold bishops accountable, essentially job reviews for bishops. And it passed with maybe 10% no votes. I'm curious if those no votes came from bishops, but it's one of those things where the bishop is sovereign in his diocese, and he really has to make a profoundly scandalous example or commit a crime or be accused of something, pretty serious in order to be relieved of duties. I mean, simple incompetence, mismanagement, favoritism. I mean, you hear parish priests all the time talk about how, what obedience to a bishop consists of. And if there's a bishop that is either not taking safeguarding seriously, mishandling abuse, or treating chancery employees and priests and the people poorly, I've heard about plenty of bishops who, and I'm not one to judge, I'm not able to do any kind of assessment, but people say they're bullies and they mistreat the, people, and really there's no mechanism for accountability. Theologically and ecclesiastically, there are some issues about oversight of a bishop, but maybe a more thorough way of overseeing bishops in the Vatican, or at least measuring their effectiveness, their making sure they aren't abusing their offices. That would be welcome. But I mean, even though it was one of the proposals of the Synod, I'll believe it when I see it.
Right. So what else was in the synthesis report? Any other talking points?
Remember all of the panic that was being spread by critics of the Synod, who were saying that it was going to implement women's ordination, or impose women's deacons on the church, or sanction same-sex blessings, or even gay marriage, or anything like that. They thought that these things were going to be proposed. They aren't found in the synthesis document. At most, they discussed this should be discussed further in terms of the female diaconate, which, by the way, it wasn't definitively ruled out by John Paul II in 1990. Women priests were. It strikes me as kind of funny that all of this panic has led to a document that basically says, let's be a more open and transparent church where we listen to one another and where we reach out to those who are poor or suffering or in pain. Now, I've already seen some radical traditionalists say that there are time bombs in this document, or that it's they've interpreted certain paragraphs to mean certain things. There's one paragraph in my article about the spiciest paragraphs. It received some pushback, and it had to do with giving authority to bishops' conferences. Because as they work right now, like the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, it is a forum for the U.S. bishops to come together for joint initiatives. But if there is a bishop in some part of the country that's doing something against the church, or that's creating scandal, or whose behavior is outrageous, you hear a lot of cries for, where is the USCCB? Well, the fact of the matter is, the USCCB does not have jurisdiction over any individual member, over any individual bishops. I've equated it a little bit to the UN, where it's this association of the nations. The United Nations is an association of the nations, but each nation has its own governments. Now, even the UN is probably more likely to put out an open criticism against a member nation. But one of the issues that they were saying to delegate the power of the USCCB over had to say that they mentioned even doctrine. Now, that could be read one of two ways. Some, and I'm sure the reactionary response, and maybe this is what was meant, I don't know, they would see it as, oh, the German bishops can make up their own internal changes in doctrine. That's asking for them to have the authority to do that. The other way of looking at it is let's say one of the bishops in your country or two of the bishops in your country have contravened doctrine, or they've sanctioned something that goes counter to Catholic doctrine. This would give the USCCB or any bishops conference a little bit of authority over its members when it comes to those issues. So I don't know what might happen from it, but it was an interesting proposal, and I'd be curious to see if it develops any further. Actually, I'd be curious to see if any of it develops any further, because a lot of it, it's basically a wish list. And the real question is whether this type of meeting, this type of dialogue is going to take place throughout the rest of the church, and B, we still have gatekeepers. Ultimately, it comes down to what the Pope decides and what he delegates to the bishops, and whether the bishops decide to go through with the program. Is it will it be a nothing burger? I certainly hope not, but I mean that, it's one of those, I'll see it when I believe it. Sometimes it takes a media outcry to, as we saw with Father Rupnik, to get church leadership to act on something. But I seriously doubt that, paragraph C of chapter 14 of this document, and I have no idea what that is, you can look it up, but I doubt there will be a groundswell from the media to make sure that the church follows through on that item. When I worked at the bishops conference, just anecdotally, I remember we would have some sort of big meeting for the department where they would show us either the new org chart or the new program that we're adopting, and here are the consultants that we've brought in to help initiate this new way of being, and it's going to happen as soon as possible, and blah blah blah. And 6 months later, it still wouldn't have been implemented. The consultants that were hired disappeared, and nothing changed. I mean, that was sort of the thing that happens typically in the church, and the people in the US would always complain about how the Vatican was super slow and super unresponsive, and that was so just compound what I experienced at the US to the universal level. I just don't, I can't tell you what the future holds, but I think that theologically the synodality is definitely the way forward for the church.
So for the last topic, talking about what's going on in Rome, Bishop Strickland, the controversial bishop of Tyler, Texas, he delivered a speech at an event called the Rome Life Forum. And yeah, he's in Rome. What is the forum? What's going on?
So the Rome Life Forum, I'm not exactly sure when it started, but I became aware of it early in Pope Francis's papacy. It's a gathering sponsored by a group called Voice of the Family. And I've mentioned them before on the Debrief. I don't know if they are affiliated with TFP, with Tradition, Family, and Property, or if they're just some of the members are involved in setting it up. It is basically a forum or a conference where a lot of the critics of Pope Francis will speak on matters regarding the church. I remember that I believe Archbishop Vigano in 2017 maybe sort of made his first big splash against Pope Francis. Not a lot of people picked up on it at this event. Cardinal Burke has spoken at it several times. It seems to be spearheaded by John Henry Weston of LifeSite News and Michael Matt of the Remnant newspaper. I'm not sure how familiar our audience is with that, but the Remnant, it's interesting. They were a spinoff. The Matt family ran the Wanderer newspaper beginning, I think it first came out in German in the 1930s, and it's a family newspaper based in Minnesota, and it's always been very conservative, or seen as very conservative or even reactionary about the church. Then I believe in 1967 there was a rift in the Matt family, and one of the brothers decided that he did not like Vatican II, and he supported Lefebvre, and didn't support the revisions of the Mass or anything that came from Vatican II. So they broke off from the Wanderer and started the Remnant newspaper, which was always sort of the smaller one until the internet came around. And the Wanderer, I guess their editors, they continued. They were very pro John Paul II, very pro Pope Benedict, very anti U.S. bishops. They would criticize a lot of the who they saw as the progressive bishops in the United States. But since the internet era has come around, the Remnant has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. Michael Matt, who is either the son or the grandson of the one who originally split off, he's the editor-in-chief of the Remnant. He's highly involved in a lot of these initiatives on the reactionary and the conservatives, or reactionary and traditionalist side of things. I don't know if you've heard the rallying cry of unite the clans. They they want to bring together the FSSP people and the SSPX people and the people who are just very strong, diocesan Latin Mass people, and they don't care about the divisions. They just want to, I guess, protest Vatican II, and as long as you're on that side, they don't care who you are. I don't think the SSPX is big fans of that. They like to be the SSPX. That's their thing. They don't like to mix. They don't like to unite the clans. They like to unite the clans under the SSPX, but that's another story. But anyway, if you remember the story last year, where Bishop Strickland shared a video in which Pope Francis was described as a diabolically disordered clown. So this is Bishop Strickland saying everyone should watch this video. Praise. Well, the person who calls Pope Francis a diabolically disordered clown is the aforementioned Michael Matt. So now he is the guest of Michael Matt at this big conference in Rome, the Rome Life Forum, and there's a picture of them sitting next to each other. Strickland gave a speech. There was another event in Pittsburgh, the Catholic Identity Conference, where they promoted that a Bishop X would be speaking at this conference, and Bishop X, introduced by Michael Matt, turns out to be Bishop Joseph Strickland. So if you want to know where Bishop Strickland is maybe getting his ideological ideas and where this shift is happening, the Remnant and Michael Matt might be a good place to look. Anyway, he's in Rome. He delivered a speech. It hasn't been posted in its entirety online, but that's it's curious that he's showing up in Rome right after the Synod.
It sounds like we're going to be coming back to that. We've discussed several times the Vatican conducted an apostolic visitation of his diocese back in June, and so far there's been no official word on the results of that visitation. Do you think he might be summoned to the Vatican while he's in Rome?
I mean, I think it would save a plane ticket, or it would expedite things. I'm fairly confident at this point that there's no way that Bishop Strickland is going to be continuing in office for much longer. But it's one of those things where the Vatican, the decision seems obvious. Like, I mean, I could tell you right now that Marko Rupnik should be dismissed from the clerical state. He should be removed from the priesthood, and there should be an apology. When that could happen a year from now. I mean, it's just sort of the way that the Vatican does things. But it's like, if he's in Rome anyway, maybe Cardinal Prevost can send him a telegram and a car and drive him on over to the dicastery for bishops. I think that would be a good, the synod's over. It's time to get back to business, and that would be a pretty promising first order of business. But that's just me, all in good time.
We'll come back maybe next week and see if anything has emerged from it. Tomorrow's November 1st. Anything you want to share on that front?
Well, so it's All Saints Day, Holy Day of Obligation. And so remember to make it to Mass if you can. And tonight is Halloween. All Souls Day is November 2nd. So the day after tomorrow. Please, remember to keep the those who have died and pray for the souls in purgatory. Keep them in your prayers, and have a blessed double feast. Don't eat too much candy. Actually, I think you can, because it's a feast day, so enjoy all the candy.
Thanks for the debrief, Mike. And I'm sure there are plenty of who watch and follow along with this show, just how valuable it is to get just an overview from somebody we trust or like to follow, or just want to have another set of insights on things. So again, as always, thanks for the debrief. Friends, if you agree, hit the like button, drop a comment. There's obviously a whole lot of divisive information out there. So getting something from where Peter is has always been invaluable for me and for my faith life and my journey. Links to all these things, they are in the description if you want to go a little deeper and read some of the posts that Mike has written on these things. And then this conversation is brought to you from SmartCatholics.com. It's our online community for millennials, creators, and learners. Join the private Where Peter Is group to ask questions, share insights, and then suggest topics for next time.
Yeah, and visit wherepeteris.com to read articles, commentaries, and spiritual reflections by and for faithful Catholics who support the mission and vision of Pope Francis.
Hit the like button, please subscribe, support Where Peter Is on Patreon, and thank you again for joining us when it comes to news and controversies in the Catholic Church. Stay curious, informed, and engaged. God bless.
God bless. Happy Halloween.